I still remember the first day I saw the bulldozers. It was early morning, that crisp, biting kind of quiet you only get when you're miles away from the city. Out there, the silence is heavy. It's just you, the wind brushing through the dry brush, and the swaying of the trees. It's peace. It's privacy. It was my land. Or at least, that's what I thought everyone knew. I'd owned that property for almost 12 years. I bought it back when I was younger and hungrier, back when the area was nothing but dirt and potential. People called me crazy for sinking my savings into a plot with no roads, no electricity, and no soul in sight for miles. But I saw something they didn't. I saw the way the city was breathing, the way it was expanding outward like a slow-moving tide. So I held on to it. I didn't build. I didn't sell. I just waited. I paid the taxes every year, checked the fences, and watched the world catch up to me. Then, on a Tuesday morning that seemed like any other, everything changed. I was driving down the old dirt access road that led to the eastern edge of my property when I saw them. Yellow steel, heavy machinery, flatbed trucks lined up like an invading army. There were workers everywhere, men in bright neon vests and hard hats, scurrying around with blueprints and clipboards. At first, my brain didn't even process it. I thought I'd taken a wrong turn. I thought maybe I'd drifted onto a neighboring county plot. But I knew every rock on that road. This was my land. My heart started to hammer against my ribs. I pulled my truck over to the side, the dust settling around me, and I stepped out. I walked toward the site, my boots crunching on the gravel they had apparently just laid down without asking. I didn't even get 20 feet before a man in a white helmet stepped in front of me, hand raised like he was directing traffic. "Sir, you can't be here," he said, his voice flat and bored. "This is a restricted construction zone."
"You need to turn around." I stared at him. I looked past him at the massive trenches being dug into my soil. "Construction?" I asked. I kept my voice steady, though my blood was starting to boil. "On whose land?" He looked confused, then annoyed. He tapped his clipboard. "This is the Highland Crest development. It's an HOA-managed project. 96 homes going up in Phase 1. Now, unless you're one of the contractors, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." 96 homes. On my land. I almost laughed. It was so absurd it felt like a hidden camera prank. "Yeah, look, there's been a massive mistake here," I said, as calmly as I could manage. "I'm the owner of this property. I have been for over a decade. I didn't sell this, and I certainly didn't authorize any HOA to start pouring concrete." The guy didn't even blink. He didn't look worried. He didn't even look curious. He just gave me a look of pure, condescending pity. "Sure thing, buddy. Listen, if you've got a boundary dispute, you'll have to take that up with the association office. I'm just here to build. Now move your truck. You're blocking the delivery lane." And just like that, I was dismissed, like I was a fly he was swatting away. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a glass of bourbon and a mountain of paper. I went through everything. The original deed, stamped and sealed, 12 years of property tax receipts, certified survey maps from when I bought the place. Every document was clean. There were no liens, no easements, no transfers, and 0 errors. The land was mine, 100%. So how was this happening? Did they lose the records? Did someone forge a signature? The next morning, I started making calls. I called the HOA office listed on the construction signs. Voicemail. I called again an hour later. "Please leave a message." I sent emails with scans of my deed attached. I even drove down to their physical office, only to be told the project manager was in meetings all day and couldn't be disturbed. It wasn't a mistake. It was a wall. They had decided I wasn't worth acknowledging. They looked at me, a guy in a flannel shirt with a small-town address, and decided I didn't have the teeth to bite back. And that's when it hit me. They weren't confused. They were confident. They were so arrogant, so sure of their own power and their big money legal teams, that they figured they could just start building and deal with the paperwork later. They figured that even if I did complain, they'd just bury me in court until I ran out of money and settled for pennies on the dollar. They knew, and they didn't care. Weeks passed, then months. I stopped calling. I stopped emailing. I stopped trying to warn them. I watched from the road as the foundations were poured. I watched the timber frames rise into the sky like skeletons.
I watched them pave roads, install streetlights, and put up fancy signs advertising luxury living starting in the 500s. It was turning into a full neighborhood right in front of my eyes. Every day I'd drive by, watching strangers build lives on something that legally belonged to me. Most people would have panicked. They would have filed for an emergency injunction. They would have hired a lawyer on day 2 to stop the bulldozers. But I didn't. See, I realized something about arrogance. Arrogance makes people sloppy. If I stopped them now, they'd lose a few $100,000, fire a surveyor, and walk away. It would be a slap on the wrist. But if I let them finish, if I let them spend every dime of their budget building 96 houses on land they didn't own, that wouldn't be a mistake. That would be a catastrophe. I started a new hobby. I became a ghost. I spent my weekends documenting everything. I took thousands of photos.
I noted dates, times, and the names of every contractor on site. I tracked the permits they pulled from the county. Permits that were somehow approved despite the land ownership records clearly sitting in the courthouse. I even attended one of their community vision meetings. I sat in the very back row, wearing an old baseball cap, sipping lukewarm coffee. I listened to them brag. The HOA board members stood at the front of the room with a slideshow, talking about projected returns and increased property values. They talked about the seamless acquisition of the land. Not once, not a single time, did anyone mention checking the title. I sat there looking at their expensive suits and their smug smiles, and I realized they had built their entire empire on a lie. And the best part? They had no idea I was the one holding the match. By the time the first row of houses was painted and the model home was open for tours, I finally walked into a law office. Not just any office, the kind of place with mahogany desks and lawyers who charge by the second. I sat down across from a man named Miller. I didn't say much. I just pushed a thick folder across the desk. Miller opened it. He looked at the deed. He looked at the photos of the 96 houses. He looked back at the deed. He took off his glasses, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and looked at me with a look of pure professional awe. "Is this current?" he asked. "They've already built these?" "They're almost finished," I said. Miller leaned back, a slow, shark-like grin spreading across his face. "If these documents are as airtight as they look, this isn't just a lawsuit. This is going to be one of the biggest legal disasters I have ever seen in this state. We could stop them today." I looked out the window, thinking about the bulldozers, the man in the white helmet, and the emails they never answered. "No," I said. "Don't stop them yet. Let them finish the landscaping. Let them put the carpets in. Let them get every single one of those houses ready for sale." Miller's grin widened. He knew exactly what I was doing. "You want them to go all in," he whispered. "I want them to build their own grave," I replied, "and I want to make sure it's deep enough for all 96 of them." They kept building, all 96 homes. What they didn't know was that every brick they laid was another nail in their coffin. And the court date? Well, that was going to be the most expensive day of their lives. By the time the construction hit the halfway mark, the landscape of my life had changed forever. It wasn't just a project anymore. It wasn't just a blueprint or a collection of wooden skeletons. It was a full-blown, high-end neighborhood. I remember standing on the edge of the property line, just outside their newly erected stone pillars, watching the blacktop spread across my soil like a dark oil slick. They had paved over the wildflowers. They had leveled the hills where I used to sit and watch the sunset. They replaced the quiet rustle of the trees with the constant rhythmic thud of hammers and the high-pitched whine of circular saws. They put in sidewalks, smooth gray ribbons of concrete where kids would eventually ride their bikes. They installed a community center with a wraparound porch and a sparkling turquoise pool that caught the afternoon light. They weren't just building houses, they were building a dream sold in brochures with glossy photos and promises of exclusive living. And the families? They started showing up sooner than I expected. I'd sit in my truck, parked a safe distance away, watching the parade of SUVs and luxury sedans. I saw young couples, hand in hand, walking through the skeletons of the houses.
I saw them pointing at where the master bedroom would be, gesturing toward the backyard where they'd put a swing set. I saw kids, little boys in superhero capes and girls with pigtails, running through the empty, dust-filled rooms like they already owned the place. Every time I saw that, I felt a strange, cold sensation in my chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even frustration anymore. It was a terrifying kind of patience, because I knew the one thing none of them did. Legally, none of it belonged to them. Not the roads they drove on, not the granite countertops they admired, not the streetlights that flickered on at dusk, and certainly not the 6 feet of earth beneath their expensive shoes.
My lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Miller who had seen every dirty trick in the real estate book, kept asking me the same question every time we met in his wood-paneled office. "Are you sure, John? Are you absolutely sure you don't want to file for an emergency injunction now?" He'd lean over his desk, tapping a pen against a satellite map of the development. We're at the point of no return. Once people actually move their furniture in, once they establish residency, it gets incredibly complicated. Judges are human. They don't like the optics of displacing 96 families because of a title dispute. I'd just lean back and shake my head. "No, Miller," I'd say. "Let it play out. Let them put the shutters on. Let them plant the sod. Let them finish." See, what most people don't understand about situations like this is that timing is everything. If I had stopped them when they were just digging holes, they could have claimed it was a good faith mistake, a surveyor's error, a clerical glitch. They would have paid a small settlement, fired a mid-level manager, and walked away with a slap on the wrist. But now, they were millions of dollars into the hole. They had signed contractors, banks, and buyers. They had leveraged their entire reputation on this project. They were too deep to swim back to shore. They were exposed, and their arrogance was the blindfold keeping them from seeing the cliff they were walking toward. I spent those months becoming a ghost in my own land. I became a master of documentation. I had folders, thick, heavy folders, filled with every permit they pulled from the county. I noticed how the permits were pushed through with suspicious speed. I tracked the names of every board member on the HOA. I took thousands of high-resolution photos. The day the first foundation was poured, the day the first roof was shingled, the day the first sold sign was hammered into my dirt. I even decided to attend one of their community vision meetings held at a local hotel ballroom. I wore an old cap pulled low and sat in the very back row. I listened to the HOA president, a man in a suit that cost more than my truck, brag about the seamless acquisition of the property. He talked about maximizing shareholder value and transforming a wasted plot of dirt into a crown jewel of the county. Not once, not a single time, did he mention a title search. They were so confident in their power, so sure that a nobody like me wouldn't have the resources to fight them, that they had simply skipped the most basic step of real estate development, making sure you actually own the land you're building on. I sat there, sipping their free, lukewarm coffee, looking at their smug, smiling faces. They had built an entire empire on a lie, and they had no idea I was the one holding the match. Months turned into a year. The homes were finally finished. All 96 of them. They were beautiful. Modern farmhouse designs, manicured lawns, designer mailboxes. They were sold out before the construction crews had even packed up their tools. People started moving in. I saw the moving trucks. I saw the welcome home banners. I saw the lights flickering on in the windows at night, turning my once dark field into a glowing grid of suburban life. People were hosting housewarming parties on land that legally belonged to a man they had never met. And that's when I finally decided it was time to speak. I didn't go down there with a megaphone. I didn't cause a scene in the streets. I did it the way they hated most, through the mail. I filed the case, quietly, no fanfare, no public drama, just a clean, surgical legal strike, delivered by a process server to the HOA's headquarters and their lead developers. At first, the response was exactly what I expected. Total silence. They didn't take it seriously. Why would they?
They were a massive entity with a legal team that charged $500 an hour. Their first formal response was a joke, a dismissive letter from a junior associate calling my claim frivolous and without merit. They treated me like a nuisance, a bug to be crushed. They offered me a nuisance settlement of $5,000 to go away and sign a non-disclosure agreement. I didn't even reply. I just had Miller send over the second folder, the one containing the original certified deed from 12 years ago, the one with the unbroken chain of title, the one with my name stamped in ink that was very, very dry. The silence that followed was different this time. It wasn't the silence of dismissal. It was the silence of a heart stopping. Suddenly, the tone changed. The go-away letters vanished. My phone started vibrating off the table at 3 a.m. They wanted to hop on a call. They wanted to grab a coffee. They wanted to find a bridge to a solution. But I remained a ghost. I didn't want a coffee. I didn't want a bridge. I wanted them to feel the ground shaking beneath their feet. As the weeks dragged on, the pressure began to leak. You can't keep a secret that big in a neighborhood that small. Rumors started floating over backyard fences. There's a problem with the titles. The developer didn't have the rights. The bank is freezing the secondary loans. The residents, the families I had watched, started to panic. They realized they had bought houses that were, legally speaking, built on air. The HOA tried to hold emergency town halls. They told the residents it was just a technicality, a paperwork delay that would be cleared up in a matter of days. They lied to their faces, even as their own lawyers were frantically begging me for a meeting. Behind closed doors, they were scrambling like rats on a sinking ship. They realized their biggest mistake wasn't the paperwork, it was me.
They had looked at a guy in a flannel shirt and assumed he wouldn't have the stomach for a long-haul fight. They thought I was a small-town distraction. But I had the one thing they didn't, the truth. And I had the patience of a man who had waited 12 years to see his land reach its full potential. Eventually, they realized their negotiation tactics, the bullying, the dismissiveness, weren't working. So they played their final card. They sent an offer, a formal, certified offer. It was more money than I had ever dreamed of, millions. Enough to buy a ranch in Montana and never work another day in my life. Enough to make all this stress vanish in an instant. Miller sat across from me, his face unreadable. "John, this is a massive settlement. It's more than the land is worth by a long shot. You could take this check, walk out that door, and this whole nightmare is over for everyone. The families keep their homes, the HOA keeps their project, and you become a very wealthy man." I looked at the check. I thought about the man in the white helmet who told me I didn't belong on my own land. I thought about the emails they ignored. I thought about the arrogance of people who think they can take what isn't theirs just because they have a bigger bank account. I looked at Miller and asked one simple question. If we go to court and the judge sees what they did, do they lose it all? Miller took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly. If we go to court, they don't just lose the land, John. They lose the structures. In this state, improvements built in bad faith on someone else's land belong to the landowner. You wouldn't just own the dirt anymore. You'd own the houses. I felt a slow smile spread across my face. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the principle. It was about the consequences of arrogance. "Tell them no," I said. Miller stared at me. "No?"
"John, you're turning down millions." "I'm not turning it down," I replied. "I'm just waiting for the court to give me what's already mine. They wanted to build a community? Fine, they built it. Now I want to see their faces when they realize they built it for me." The court date was set. The trap was locked. And as I drove past the neighborhood that night, seeing the 96 homes glowing in the dark, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going away. And neither was I. The morning of the court date felt different. The air was heavy, like the moments just before a massive storm breaks. I dressed slowly, not in a fancy suit like their lawyers, but in a clean, iron shirt and work boots. I didn't need to pretend to be someone I wasn't. The truth was on my side, and the truth doesn't need a designer tie. When I pulled up to the courthouse, the parking lot was already overflowing. It wasn't just the legal teams, it was the homeowners, dozens of them. People I had seen moving their couches into their new living rooms, now standing on the courthouse steps with terrified expressions. I saw the HOA board members too. They were huddled together in a tight circle, whispering urgently, their faces pale under the flickering fluorescent lights of the hallway. The courtroom itself was packed to the rafters.
It felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a funeral for a multi-million-dollar mistake. I walked in quietly, my footsteps echoing on the polished marble floor. I took my seat next to Miller, my lawyer. I remained calm. I remained focused. For the first time in over a year, the heavy knot of anticipation in my chest had finally loosened. Across the aisle, the HOA's dream team of lawyers looked like they hadn't slept in a week. The arrogance I had encountered on that first day with the bulldozers, it was gone. The condescension evaporated. Now there was only the suffocating pressure of a looming public disaster. The judge entered the room, and the gavel slammed down with a sound that felt like a gunshot. The case was officially open. The HOA's dream team of lawyers looked like they hadn't slept in a week. The arrogance I had encountered on that first day with the bulldozers, it was gone. The condescension evaporated. Now there was only the suffocating pressure of a looming public disaster. The judge entered the room, and the gavel slammed down with a sound that felt like a gunshot. The case was officially open. The HOA's dream team of lawyers looked like they hadn't slept in a week. The arrogance I had encountered on that first day with the bulldozers, it was gone. The condescension evaporated. Now there was only the suffocating pressure of a looming public disaster. The judge entered the room, and the gavel slammed down with a sound that felt like a gunshot. The case was officially open. The HOA's dream team of lawyers looked like they hadn't slept in a week. The arrogance I had encountered on that first day with the bulldozers, it was gone. The condescension evaporated. Now there was only the suffocating pressure of a looming public disaster.
He spun a web of technicalities, trying to confuse the court with clerical errors, overlapping county maps, and good faith development. He tried to paint a picture of a tragic misunderstanding. He talked about the human cost, the 96 families who had invested their life savings into these homes. He even tried to turn the tables on me, suggesting that I had predatorily waited for the project to finish just to maximize my leverage. He called me a squatter on my own land. He called my silence malicious intent. I sat there, stone-faced, listening to them drag my name through the mud. I didn't flinch, I didn't react, I just waited. Then it was our turn. Miller didn't start with a long, dramatic speech. He didn't use big words or complex legal theories. He simply stood up, adjusted his glasses, and walked slowly to the center of the room. He carried a single weathered folder. From it, he pulled out the original certified deed to the property, the one I had kept in a fireproof safe for 12 years. He placed it on the evidence table under the projector so the whole room could see it. "Your Honor," Miller began, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a mountain, "we are not here to discuss feelings or clerical confusion. We are here to discuss the law, and the law is written in ink that does not fade." He pointed to the document. "This land has belonged to my client since long before the first shovel hit the dirt. My client paid the taxes. My client maintained the boundaries. My client never signed a contract, never authorized a sale, and never granted an easement." The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the air conditioning. You could hear the frantic scribbling of the court reporter. "The defendants," Miller continued, turning to look directly at the HOA board, "were warned. On the very first day of construction, they were told they were on private property. They chose to ignore that warning. They chose to skip a title search. They chose to gamble with other people's money and other people's lives because they thought they were too big to be stopped." The judge leaned forward, her eyes narrow as she examined the deed. She looked at the county records. She looked at the tax receipts Miller had meticulously organized. For the next 3 hours, it was a slow-motion car crash for the HOA. Every time they tried to claim they had a right to be there, Miller produced another document proving they didn't. He showed the emails I had sent that went unanswered. He showed the logs of the phone calls I had made that were never returned. He proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the HOA hadn't just made a mistake, they had been willfully, dangerously arrogant. Arguments turned into desperate pleas. The HOA's lawyers started sweating. They realized the technicality defense was a sinking ship. They started talking about equitable settlements and mandatory buyouts. They were begging for a way out that didn't involve total destruction. But the law doesn't care about the ego of a developer. And the truth? The truth was simple.
It was undeniable. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the courtroom, the judge finally sat back. She didn't even need to retire to her chambers to think it over. She had seen enough. She looked at the HOA representatives, and her voice was like ice. In 20 years on this bench, she said, I have never seen a more flagrant disregard for property rights. You didn't just build a neighborhood, you built a monument to your own hubris. The ruling was a total scorched earth victory. The court found that the development was built entirely on land that legally belonged to me. Everything else, the houses, the roads, the community center, was legally classified as improvements built in bad faith. Under state law, those improvements didn't belong to the people who built them.
They belonged to the owner of the land, me. The room exploded. I saw homeowners break down in tears. I saw HOA board members fleeing out the side door to avoid the cameras. I saw the lead developer put his head in his hands, realizing that his career was effectively over. The HOA didn't just lose the case, they lost everything. They were ordered to pay my legal fees, which were astronomical. They were hit with punitive damages for the emotional distress caused to the residents they had lied to. And the 96 homes? They were now part of a legal nightmare that would take years to untangle. In the end, I didn't tear the houses down. I'm not a monster. But I didn't give them away for free either. The HOA was forced to buy the land back from me at a price that made the previous settlement offer look like pocket change. They had to pay every cent I asked for it just to keep the residents from being evicted. People still ask me the same questions when they hear the story. Do you regret waiting so long? Do you feel bad for the people who moved in? I tell them the same thing every time. I gave them a chance. I stood in the dirt under the morning sun and I told them the truth when it would have cost them nothing to listen. I reached out when a simple conversation could have fixed everything. They chose to ignore me. They chose to believe that their wealth made them invincible and my quiet nature made me a victim. They decided I didn't matter. Everything that happened, the millions of dollars lost, the ruined reputations, the panic in that courtroom, was their decision. It was the harvest of the seeds they planted on land that wasn't theirs. I just stayed quiet until court day. The lesson? Never mistake a man's silence for his surrender, because sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who's already won.